Ecclesiastes chapter 7. Ecclesiastes chapter 7. The gentleman that was just here, I think he just left, right? Is Dan Billingsley. He said he got his start here, I think about 60 years ago. Is that what he said? And started preaching the gospel. And for years preached the truth and was a strong preacher of the truth. Preached at Broadway for a few years. Unfortunately, he doesn't preach the truth anymore. I'm not saying that because he's not here. I would say that if he was here. He wanted to make an announcement, and because I know what his doctrine is, he teaches Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John is not a part of the New Testament. That's called the Billingsley's doctrine. And the reason that is because you get around Matthew 19:9 and the passages that deal with marriage and divorce. It breaks my heart to say that. I don't say that with any joy or rejoicing. We had very kind words as we spoke. That's the first time I spoke to him in person. But I've read some things that he has taught, and they're erroneous. And some of you who are shaking your heads know. And I didn't feel comfortable allowing him to get up before the congregation and make any announcement at all. And so I hated to be put on a spot like that. I made a judgment call because he was asking me. He came to me to ask. And I asked him to verify, are you the Dan Billingsley that teaches that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John's not a part of the New Testament? He said, yes, I am. I said, I can't let you go up there. And I'm not trying to speak for the men of the congregation. I'm not the leader of this congregation at all. But he came to me and asked me. Yes. Sure. Go right ahead.
If thou put the brethren in remembrance of these things, thou shalt be a good minister of Jesus Christ. There is depth in the word of faith and good doctrine. But do thou have some time. You can't stand it, brother.
It is emotional. I appreciate those words, and I can feel the hurt there. It's not easy to take a stand, but it has to be done. It will be worth it in the end, and we can't compromise. Even though he's a gentleman, we had a good conversation sitting there. That's the first time I ever spoke with him. He tried to get a hold of me yesterday, but was not able to get a hold of me. So this was all sprung on me just right then. And so, and when I verified that's the same Dan Billingsley that I'm aware of, many faithful brethren have met him in debate and exposed his doctrine as false, and he has not renounced it. He hasn't repented of it. And he currently still teaches it. And it's not easy. It has to be done. And it's not going to be easy. It's perhaps he didn't know our order of worship, and I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt. Okay, but I'm not going to. He was very kind to me, and when I said I can't let you make an announcement because I oppose your doctrine, he was very gracious, very nice to me, and that's all I can say. That's all I can base judgment on. Right. Well, it kind of goes along with what we're looking at. Look at Ecclesiastes 7 and verse 1. A good name is better than precious ointment, and the day of death than the day of one's birth. If your name is associated with false teaching, then faithful brethren are going to recognize it just like that. If I say the name Max Lucado, faithful brethren, no. He's not faithful to the Lord. If I say Johnny Ramsey, that's a good reputation. Faithful to the Lord. Powerful preacher for years. A good name is better than precious ointment. Ointment was something very precious in the ancient world. They didn't have any, all the medical things that we have. Precious ointment was something that was soothing. It was something that was very beneficial. And so having a good name means a good reputation. And even though he might have, and I'm not picking on him, even though Brother Billingsley got started here 60 years ago and started out good, he has not kept the faith. Even though he's a kind and gentle person, from what I can see, kind and gentle, maybe inappropriate in his approach there, but talking to me very kind, and I returned that kindness to him, But I told him I oppose him. I can't compromise. And a good name is better than precious ointment. The day of death than the day of one's birth. What does that mean? The second part of verse 1. The day of death is better than the day of one's birth. That's a good point. You know nothing when you come in. You're not even aware of anything till later on. You become self-aware. You reach accountability, we call it. Become aware of things, aware of self, aware of sin. Right. Right. Well, sure. All of us were better than we were babies. That's a good point. I mean, think of Adolf Hitler. He was good when he was a baby, innocent. But he went bad somewhere down the road. And so it's one of those things of from the perspective of living a righteous life, the day of one's death is better than the day of one's birth. Because in the day of one's birth, you live and grow up. What kind of person is this going to be? Is this person going to live righteously or live unrighteously? teach the truth or teach error. And so there is the potential in the day of one's birth for someone to grow up and be lost. But if a righteous person dies in righteousness, that's a day of rejoicing. We sorrow because we miss them. We sorrow over that. Philippians 1:21, for me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. That's right. To live for Christ means if you live in that condition all the way till death, be faithful into death, Revelation 2:10, you get a crown of life. So the day of one's death is better than the day of one's birth. You're born into a world of sorrow, pain, suffering, danger. In our society, there's danger before you're born. With abortion, murder, pre-birth murder is what it is. And so you're conceived and born into a world with dangers. You got parents that are just absolutely crazy. Some of them, if you heard the ones on the news lately that have tortured their children. I mean, children are born into families like that. The wickedness. And so it depends on the perspective and understanding God's will. Then the day of one's death is better than the day of one's birth. Look at Proverbs 22:1. A lot of what we're going to find in chapter 7 is basically Proverbs, and it parallels a lot you find in the book of Proverbs. Proverbs 22. And verse 1, a good name is to be chosen rather than great riches, loving favor rather than silver and gold. A good name. When they hear your name and when your name is remembered, what kind of reputation will be associated with that name? That's more precious than great riches or silver and gold. I mean, when you think of names within the Bible, Cain and Abel, students of the Bible, you immediately have a contrast. Someone wicked, Cain. Someone who did the will of God, Abel, and was killed for doing the will of God. You have a contrast there. Elijah and Jezebel. Again, a contrast. You hear those names. Judas, Peter. Again, a contrast. Those names stir up remembrance of a reputation because we know it from the Word of God. So there are things more important than silver and gold, or riches and things of that nature. It's a good reputation. And what's a good reputation based upon? Doing good works. According to who? According to the Word of God. According to doing God's will. God's will. You might make a name for yourself in the world. Yet, if your name is not a name that's associated with truth, doing what's right and doing what's correct, then all your praise from the world means nothing. I mean, you can go into bookstore after bookstore and see Max Lucado. He's got his own line of greeting cards. He has calendars. He has books. He has a whole shelf of books all to himself. The religious world, the book reviews within the religious world from any denomination praises the name of Max Lucado. He is called the #1 Christian writer in America, or close to it, if not the #1. I mean, every name brand denomination and every high-profile evangelist, false teacher within the denominations laud and praise the name of Max Lucado. But you can't associate that name with truth. You can't associate that name with truth and standing for what's right. If he did, he wouldn't be that popular. What did Jesus say? That which is highly esteemed among men is an abomination in the eyes of God. And so we've got to look at things from the way God sees things, and a good name is better than precious ointment, better than riches, better than silver and gold, because a good name is associated with doing what's right. Look at verse 2, Ecclesiastes 7 and verse 2. Better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting, for that is the end of all men, and the living will take it to heart. Again, he's contrasting here the day of birth and the day of death here. Going to the house of mourning, that would be the house of mourning over someone who has passed, someone who has died. And Solomon's saying here it's better to go to that house than to go to the house of feasting. And because he says in verse 2, for that is the end of all men, what we're all going to die. Death is coming to us all. And the living take it to heart. What does that mean? The living take it to heart when they go to a house of mourning. That means they are contemplating the end of their life. You know, every time you go to a funeral, you partake in a funeral, you start thinking, one day I'm going to be in that casket. You start thinking seriously more about spiritual things, and you realize the temporariness of life, how that it's only temporary, and one day we're going to die. The Lord does not return in our life. We're going to face death. And so the living go to the house of mourning where there is a funeral, where people are contemplating death, and they take it to heart. Sometimes that sobers people up. I'm not just talking about those who drink. I'm talking about those who are not living sober-mindedly. People who are not level-headed. People who do not live according to the will of God and are tossed to and fro. They're not sober-minded. It sobers them up to the reality, hey, one day I'm going to die. And all that matters, and this is the point of the book of Ecclesiastes, is that I feared God and kept His commandments. That's it. So it gets people to evaluate their life. I guess that's the word I'm looking for. Evaluate themselves when they go to the house of mourning. Look at verse 3, Ecclesiastes 7 and verse 3. Sorrow is better than laughter, for by a sad countenance the heart is made better. Sorrow, or some translations might say vexation or grief, is better, he says, than laughter. Now, how can that be? We're told in Proverbs that laughter, a merry heart, does good like medicine. But there's a time for everything. Isn't that what he said earlier in the book? There's a time for laughter. There's a time for crying. I believe that was chapter 3, right? Chapter 3. There's a time for laughter. There's a time for crying. When we go to the house of mourning, when we go to remember the passing of a loved one, that sorrow is part of the evaluation process, the self-evaluation that we do. Looking at life and looking at death. A sad countenance, he says in verse 3, for the sad countenance, the heart is made better. You get to start thinking about things that you probably wouldn't normally think about when you go to the house of mourning. It helps put things in perspective. Verse 4. Ecclesiastes 7 and verse 4. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of mirth. Mirth there refers to merriment, that which is associated with a feast. And so verse 4 there, the heart of the wise is in the house of the mourning. But fools are those who are in the house of mirth. They just want to be feasting and think happy thoughts all the time, and they don't want to think sad thoughts. They don't want to really self-evaluate themselves. In other words, don't bother me with this. I just want to have a good time. Don't bother me with death. Don't bother me with the fact that one day I'm going to have to die and give an account of my life to the Lord. I don't want to hear that. I want to go feast. And so the fool focuses in on that. But mourning, having sorrow in a life, is normal. It's what is healthy. That's not something that continues in a life, because we're to rejoice in the Lord always. Book of Philippians, the key word in that book is rejoice. But sorrow has its place. And, even in psychology and what you find in the Bible is God's psychology, God's will for the psyche, for the mind. They say sorrow has its place. There is a place for mourning. There is a place for sorrow. That has to be there in the normal human life. Ecclesiastes 7 and verse 5. It is better to hear the rebuke of the wise than for a man to hear the song of fools. For like the crackling of thorns under a pot, so is the laughter of the fool. This also is vanity. Surely oppression destroys a wise man's reason, and a bribe debases the heart. So here Solomon is saying it's better to hear the rebuke of the wise than the man to hear the songs of fools. Sometimes we need to be rebuked by someone wise. I need it. We need it. And when we're listening to wise rebuke, that helps keep us on the right path. We need to hear that wise rebuke, and it's better than to hear the songs of fools. In other words, when you don't listen to rebuke, and you always listen to that which makes you happy, makes you feel better. You don't want to hear anything negative because it makes you feel bad. In our society, we want our children to have good self-esteem. We don't want to injure them emotionally. We don't want to tell them they're wrong. And that's the problem in the school system. Ask Jennifer, teaching 8th grade math. No one wants to correct anyone because it might make them feel bad if you rebuke them. That's the devil at work. That's the devil at work. If he can undermine discipline within schools, undermine that, then he's got a society. And we from time to time, we need to hear that wise rebuke. He says the laughter of fools, verse 6, is like the crackling of thorns under a pot. Think of thorns, and you got a pot. You're putting that pot down on the thorns, and they're crackling under the weight of that pot. So is the laughter of the fool. This also is vanity. There's that word vanity that's found throughout the book of Ecclesiastes. Verse 7, surely oppression destroys a wise man's reason, and bribe debases the heart. One writer said this, oppression is demoralizing and can corrupt a wise man so that he behaves as a fool in spite of his wisdom. So there is an oppression that weighs down on a person, and it can destroy a wise man's reason. Bribery, further the quote goes, bribery is also a corruptive evil. Bribery debases the heart. When people can be bribed, it makes people's morality disintegrate, and it brings them down to the lowest common denominator. In other words, people are saying, I'll do anything for money. I can be bought. I can be bought. Basically what they're saying. Look at verse 8. Ecclesiastes 7 and verse 8. The end of a thing is better than the beginning. The patient in spirit is better than the proud in heart. Do not hasten in your spirit to be angry, for anger rests in the bosom of fools. Verse 10. Do not say, why were the former days better than these? For you do not inquire wisely concerning this. Verse 8, he says the end of a thing is better than the beginning. That would go back to what he was saying earlier. The end of something, the outcome of something is better than the beginning. Because when you're starting something out, you're going through uncharted water, so to speak. You're going through a process. You've never done this before, or you don't know what lies ahead. But when you finish it, you can look back on it and say, okay, And you can learn from the past. You can learn from those things. Learn from the successes. Learn from the failures. You can learn from those things. So the end of a thing is better than the beginning. The patient in spirit is better than the proud in heart. Being patient. How many times in the New Testament we're told to have patience, to have endurance, to hang in there, basically, stick with it, is better than the proud of spirit. Verse 9, do not be hastened in your spirit to be angry, for the anger rests in the bosom of fools. Look at Proverbs 14:17. A quick-tempered man acts foolishly. A man of wicked intention is hated. Quick-tempered. That's why it speaks of the elders in the church not to be soon angry or hot-headed, quick-tempered, because they make foolish mistakes. When we do something and say something out of anger, it's usually foolish. I know it is when I do it. You make a foolish mistake. You say something you wouldn't normally say because you're mad. You do something you wouldn't normally do because you're mad. And so he says, don't hasten in your spirit to be angry. We looked at what James said in James chapter 1. Be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath. Slow to get angry. Quick to hear. Listen. Evaluate it. Take it all in. Consider all the facts. Then make a decision. Shouldn't make a decision out of the emotions. Now, does anger have a place? Sure. Christ got angry. He didn't sin. It says of Him that He looked on them with anger, at the hardness of their heart. Oftentimes you find that in the gospel accounts. Do you think He was angry when He went into the temple and overturned the money changers and they turned the Lord's house into an exchange of goods and services and defiled the Lord's house with the business that was going on there? And He made a whip of cords. He went in there and He overturned the tables and everything. And it says, you have made my Father's house a den of thieves. That was anger, but it was righteous. I think it was Paul in Ephesians that said, be angry and sin not. There's things that we're to be angry about. But we're not to allow that to cause us to sin. And so anger has its part. It's the normal part of who we are. But we shouldn't allow it to be something that causes us to sin. And we shouldn't make decisions or be quick to anger. We need to be patient and think things through. Verse 10, do not say, why were the former days better than these? For you do not inquire wisely concerning this. Oh, for the good old days. How many times, I'm not hardly old enough to talk about that. I grew up in the 70s and 80s. So, but I look back, go back to Grand Prairie where I grew up, look at how things are changing and think how things used to be when I was a teenager and such, and you think about the good old days. And nothing wrong with looking back and seeing those things and contemplating those things. But people say the former days were better than these. Yeah, turn the air conditioner off. Put your toilet outside in the backyard. Get rid of the microwave. No TV dinners. No TV. Get rid of those things. And you look back on how people lived back then, and you admire what they had to go through. And some of you have lived without those things in your past, but aren't you glad you have a washer and dryer now? I mean, it's not just in the area of technology, but also we have opportunities now to spread the gospel we didn't have 50 years ago. We have opportunities now. The internet. I got an email from a lady in Arkansas wanting a Bible correspondence course because she saw the website. I would not have known that woman even existed if it wasn't for that. So the opportunities we have now to do things that are great is a wonderful opportunity. And when you look back at the church of the past, and people long for the church of the past and talk about the church in the 40s, 50s, and 60s and how it grew and everything, that was great and we were sound, but the Lord's church had to deal with prejudice back in those days. That's just as much a sin as liberalism is today. I've been told by older brethren how that people wouldn't allow people of color in to the congregation. That's sin. Now, is that as good as it is now? We need to think about those things. Right. I mean, and people look back on those and say, oh, it's the good old days. Well, for who? I mean, for who is that a good old day? So there are things we look back and we learn on the past, but we don't dwell on that. In a lot of ways, we need the caliber of preachers that we had in the 1800s, in the 1900s. Right. That's what Christ said. That's a good point. Any man puts his hand to the plow and looks back is not fit for the kingdom. We got to move forward with the gospel. We don't change to accommodate culture. We don't change the will of God, but we use the blessings that we have to spread the gospel that we didn't have before, things of that nature. And so we don't dwell on the past. Basically, I believe that's what he's saying there in verse 10. Look at verse 11. Wisdom is good with an inheritance and profitable to those who see the sun. Verse 12. For wisdom is a defense as money is a defense, but the excellence of knowledge is that wisdom gives life to those who have it. So what you have here in verse 11, wisdom is good with an inheritance and profitable for those who see the sun. If you have wisdom and you have an inheritance, you can do so much good. You can do so much good. Verse 12, wisdom is a defense as money is a defense. But the excellence of knowledge is that wisdom gives life to those who have it. You have wisdom, it gives you a defense as money can give you a defense. But the excellence of knowledge is wisdom gives life. The wisdom that we find in the Bible, a person who is considered wise is someone who does God's will. That gives life. And so that is the profitableness of wisdom. Look at verse 13. Consider the work of God, for who can make straight what He has made crooked? You can't make straight what God has made crooked. And you cannot make crooked, the opposite would be, you cannot make crooked that which He's made straight. You're not going to change the will of God. Verse 14, in the day of prosperity be joyful, but in the day of adversity consider, surely God has appointed the one as well as the other, so the man can find out nothing that will come after him. Verse 14, in the day of prosperity, when you're prospering, be joyful, but in the day of adversity, when you're coming on hard times, consider. Contemplate. Think about what's going on. Surely God has appointed the one as well as the other. And you look at Job. Isn't Job an example of that? The Lord gives, the Lord takes away. Whatever, blessed be the name of the Lord. Job didn't stop serving God when he faced tremendous adversity in his life. He said, well, the Lord gave it to me. The Lord took it away. I'm still going to serve the Lord. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And so I believe that's exactly what we're considering here. So that man can find out nothing that will come after him. We can't know what will come after him. Hasn't he said this earlier in the book? How do you know you build this inheritance for your son? You don't know whether your son's going to be a fool or wise. You don't know what's going to come after you. And when you die, you've left this world behind. And the basic point is, why focus on it? Why focus on it? Because you're going to leave it all behind. You don't know if your son's going to be wise or a fool. You focus on God. That's the point he's trying to get across. Verse 15, I have seen everything in my days of vanity. There is a just man who perishes in his righteousness, and there is a wicked man who prolongs life in wickedness. So here you have Solomon. He's saying he's seen things in the days of his vanity. That word vanity means uselessness, nothingness. He says, here's something that I have seen. There is a good person who dies in righteousness. They might die a life in a life of righteousness. They might die before their time, as we would say. Then there's a wicked man who prolongs his life in wickedness. Lives very, very long, but they're wicked. But when you think about it, who's the real winner in this situation? A young man or a young person, a young man or a woman who dies in righteousness, they're going to a better place. But a wicked man, if he lives to be 110 years old, he's going to be lost in an eternal hell. Still going to leave everything behind and then be lost. And there was one who died in righteousness at a fairly young age. We talked about him this morning. Jesus of Nazareth. He died in perfect righteousness. And so this is something that is to contemplate. You look, but you step back and you look, and you think, man, this is vanity. If I'm serving the Lord, but if a person serves the Lord, they might die an untimely death. But then you see this wicked person prosper, and they live to be so long. Yet you've got to step back from that and look at it the way God looks at it. That person who prolongs their life in wickedness, they're not the winners. They're not the winners. We will continue studying Ecclesiastes 7 next week. Go ahead and read chapter 8, and we will go into it.